Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a massive puzzle from the archives of parapsychology, and honestly, it challenges the very bedrock of experimental science. Here's the paradox we're going to explore. In psi research, the single best predictor of an experiment's outcome isn't the participants, and it isn't the environment. No, it's the identity of the principal investigator. That's right. Literally, who is running the study dictates whether the whole thing succeeds or fails.
So let me ask you this. What if the scientist running the test is the actual psychic? I mean, think about it. The scientific method completely relies on strict reproducibility, right? But in the world of psi research, this mechanism seems completely, hopelessly broken. You've got some researchers who consistently get statistically significant results, while others, they consistently get absolutely nothing. So who or what is the culprit here? Let's meet our suspects.
Okay, let's dive into this. Suspect number 1, the behavior hypothesis.
Before we jump straight into the supernatural stuff, we really need to look at normal human psychology. The experimenter behavior hypothesis suggests that a researcher's interpersonal skills are basically the secret weapon here. It posits that a researcher's warmth, their friendliness, or even their hostility might directly dictate whether a participant succeeds or fails at a cognitive task. Makes sense, right? If you're brought into a lab by a cold, irritable scientist, you might be way too anxious to perform well. But if the experimenter is encouraging and warm, well, you might relax just enough for your intuition to actually shine through.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this fascinating 1981 study by Schmeidler and Maher that actually put these traits to the test. They showed students videotapes of different parapsychology experimenters, some who historically got great results and some who always failed. The students, who had absolutely no idea about the experimenters' track records, rated the successful, psi-conducive experimenters as flexible, enthusiastic, and warm. Meanwhile, the unsuccessful ones were literally weighted as rigid, cold, and dull. Basically, your stereotypical, unapproachable scientist. It's a super compelling argument that just basic human bedside manner is driving the data.
Moving on to section 2, we have the ultimate showdown: skeptic versus believer.
To really put this behavior hypothesis to the test, world-renowned skeptic Richard Wiseman and well-known believer Marilyn Schlitz collaborated on this incredibly unique experiment. The setup was simple, but honestly brilliant. They wanted to test if participants could physically detect when they were being remotely stared at. So, the participants were hooked up to equipment measuring their autonomic nervous system. Wiseman and Schlitz would sit in a distant room and randomly stare at the participant through a video monitor. The big question: would the participants' nervous system spike when they were being watched, even if they consciously had absolutely no idea?
Get this, they used the exact same equipment and they pulled from the exact same pool of undergraduate students. Yet, Marilyn Schlitz, the believer, yielded significantly positive psi effects. Her participants' bodies genuinely reacted when she stared at them. Richard Wiseman, the skeptic, yielded completely non-significant, basically chance results. Their wildly differing expectations and their interactions with the subjects yielded completely opposing results, strongly reinforcing the idea that the experimenter themselves is the absolute most critical variable in the room.
All right, brace yourselves for suspect number 2, the experimenter's psi hypothesis.
What if normal psychological behavior isn't the cause at all? What if the researcher themselves is the one projecting the psychic influence, entirely bypassing the participant? This is known as the experimenter psi hypothesis, or EPSI for short. It asks us to consider something quite radical: that investigators unconsciously influence the outcome of their own experiments by inadvertently imposing their own psychic abilities. I mean, think about it. In most of these studies, the principal investigator has this deep, burning desire for the experiment to succeed. What if that desire secretly and unconsciously drives the results, effectively making the scientist the real subject of the test?
So the crucial point is, how does this even work mechanically? Well, we look to Stanford's PMIR model, which stands for Psi-Mediated Instrumental Response. It suggests that human beings are constantly, unconsciously scanning their external environment for information relevant to their needs. We then act on this information without any conscious awareness at all. If a researcher desperately needs a positive outcome to validate their life's work, Stanford's model suggests they might use unintentional psi to fulfill that deep desire. They essentially wish the experiment into succeeding without even knowing it, which, let's be honest, is a pretty wild thing to imagine a PhD doing in a sterile lab.
But wait, is it always unconscious? Well, Marilyn Schlitz actually interviewed several successful parapsychology experimenters, and their answers were incredibly revealing. Listen to this quote from one of her interviews.
What I like to do is focus on the individual trial as if it were the only thing in the world. The main task is to fill myself with the goal. This shows that some researchers aren't just passively observing. They are actively using visualization and intense mental focus to arguably psychically influence their own results. They are literally trying to force the data to conform to their expectations.
Which leads us into some even weirder territory, the checker effect, retroactive influence.
This brings us to observational theories, where the mere act of looking at data might actually alter it. Consider this absolutely bizarre study from 1953 by West and Fisk. They prepared sealed decks of cards to be mailed to participants who were asked to guess the order of the cards without looking at them. But here is the catch. Fisk had a reputation as a psi-conducive experimenter, while West was considered psi-inhibitory. The participants had absolutely no idea who packed which envelope, yet statistically the participants guessed the cards significantly better if they were packed by Fisk rather than West. It's as if the mere touch of the experimenter left some sort of residue that influenced the outcome from miles away.
And studies by Weiner and Zinkrone involving the actual tallying of data make this even stranger. Let's walk through it. Step 1. A participant makes their guesses. Step 2. That data is sealed inside opaque envelopes. The experiment is essentially over, right? Actually, scratch that, wrong. In these studies, who opened the envelopes and checked the scores seemingly dictated whether there was a positive or negative result. If a specific person tallied the score, it retroactively altered the result. It heavily implies that the observer looking at the final data is the one collapsing the quantum wave function, effectively creating the result in the past.
How on earth could a researcher's mind mechanically achieve this? Decision augmentation theory, or DAT, offers one possible answer. If you're using a random number generator, there is naturally a 5% chance of a statistically significant random sequence occurring at any given moment. DAT proposes that an experimenter, or maybe the participant, unconsciously precognizes the target stream and picks the exact right millisecond to press the start button. To put that into perspective, they aren't somehow magically altering the machine, they are just using psychic intuition to perfectly hit that 5% jackpot window.
So, bringing it all together, the final verdict on the replication crisis. Why does all of this matter to you and me? Well, it brings us home to a very real-world hurdle that extends far beyond the fringes of parapsychology, and that is the bedrock of the replication crisis in science. As we've seen, in psi research, between investigator replicability is exceptionally low. Different researchers get entirely different results when performing the exact same experiment. However, within investigator replicability is incredibly high. The same researcher can consistently get the same results over and over again. This means the science is tightly bound to the individual scientist. In traditional physics or chemistry, that means your experiment is flawed. But in parapsychology, it might mean the experimenter is literally the active ingredient.
John Palmer, a really prominent voice in this field, summed it up perfectly. He said, "The between-investigator replication problem is the single most important challenge parapsychologists face in their efforts to convince mainstream scientists." And he hit the nail on the head. Until the field can figure out how to isolate the experimenter from the experiment, whether that interference is psychological behavior or unconscious psychic influence, parapsychology is going to remain locked out of mainstream scientific acceptance. The observer is quite literally contaminating the observation.
Which leaves us with this final, profound question to ponder today. Whether you lean toward normal psychological explanations, like a researcher's warmth and friendliness, or if you lean toward the mind-bending theories of experimenter psi and retroactive checking, can science ever truly separate the observer from the observed? Are we ever really just neutral bystanders in the universe? Or does the very act of looking change the world around us? It's a fascinating paradox, and one that absolutely forces us to question the very nature of scientific discovery. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.